The Himalayas. A mountain range separating the continents of India and Asia. It may be one of the most consequential geologic features on the planet. So tall and so vast that it blocks migratory birds. If we were to wake up tomorrow and find that the Himalayas were gone, it would affect the weather patterns and climate of the entire planet. Between 40 and 50 million years ago, the continents of India collided with Asia, pushing the Earth's crust at the point of contact higher and higher until it became the tallest mountain range on our planet. And it's still growing, climbing about 1.5 feet every year. In about 300,000 years, if you stood on its highest peak, you'd be closer to space than you would be to sea level. This mountain range is so desolate and inaccessible that there are places in the Himalayas that have never been touched by humans. And the first person to reach the summit of Everest, the tallest peak in these mountains, didn't do so until only 13 years before the first man set foot on the moon. In 1942, at the end of the Second World War, a park ranger named Hari Kishan Madhwal was patrolling a desolate stretch of high-altitude wilderness, 16,500 feet above sea level, a 5-day trek from the nearest town. For most of the year, this particular area would have gone unnoticed, but as he passed by a small pond only a few hundred feet across, the spring thaw allowed him to see into the clear water of this glacial meltwater lake. As he peered into the water, he saw what was unmistakably a human skeleton. And then another. And then another. He saw what he thought must have been dozens. When he was finally able to trek back down and report to his superiors days later what he saw, his superiors assumed it was the remains of Japanese soldiers attempting to secretly pass through the mountains. It wasn't until 1956, and multiple attempts, that a team from the Anthropological Survey of India was able to reach Roopkund Lake to investigate the claims made by Madhwal. When they returned, they estimated that at least 300 human skeletons were located within and around this small lake, isolated by days of travel from civilization. They found that many of the skeletons had not fully decomposed, with skin and other tissue still attached. However, these remains were much older than the state of these bodies appeared. The samples they returned with upended the theory that these were Japanese soldiers. Several of the skulls had injuries resembling blunt force trauma with some kind of round object. When the bones were later subjected to radiocarbon dating by the University of Oxford, they were surprised to learn that they seemed to be from around the year 850 Common Era. So how did they get there over 1,000 years ago? So for those of you who are anxiously awaiting for the release of The Hum Part 2, just wanted to let you know that is still coming. I just hit a little bit of a snag during filming. Although separated by only a river, the cities of Detroit, Michigan and Windsor, Ontario could not stand in more contrast to one another.
Read.
No.
Raid Shadow Legends is a console quality experience that's available on your mobile device.
Raid Shadow Legends. You know it. You love it. Happy birthday to Raid Shadow Legends. It's hard to believe Raid is 2 years old already. They grow up so fast.
Alright, kid, let's go. It's time for some Raid Shadow Legends. Come on, get me out of this bag. Time to turn you into a man. Let's get you armored up and ready to go with a brand new champion. Don't let diapers get away. Out of the come. Alright, let's go. Out of the bag. Wait, what are you doing? Get me out of here. No, out of the bag. Out of the bag. Come on.
The biggest free-to-play mobile game around. Millions of players worldwide. For a battle this face-melting and intense, you'll want to check out the more than 500 champions available in-game right now. Wait, 500 characters? How do you pick one? There's so many of them. Just pick this one. Pick this one. It's really good. I like this one. Look what she does with the swords. Raid is bigger and better than ever before. This month is Raid's 2-year anniversary. There's new special events to quench your thirst for battle. 6 straight weeks of anniversary events and tournaments running from March 1st all the way through the middle of April with some of the biggest, most insane prizes. And since you've built your clan to full strength, check out the new Clan vs. Clan tournament. And just when you didn't think that wasn't enough, 12 new champions. If you've been holding out and want a head start in Raid, all you have to do is hit the link in the description or scan my QR code and you'll get a free epic champion, Jotun. Jotun is amazing for the new Doom Tower. You'll also get 100,000 silver, 50 gems, and the 3 ancient shards so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in game. Play Raid Shadow Legends today.
Some believed it was a group of traveling merchants. Some believed that an epidemic had wiped them out. As the anthropology community grappled with this find, they quickly learned that the bones were much, much older than had previously been assumed. On top of obtaining an approximate time period that they had come from, they also had a few other clues. One of the most puzzling parts of this story was the extreme isolation of the location in which they were found. Hundreds of skeletons, days travel away from any settlements, all deposited in this small lake high in the mountains, not located along any trade routes or settlements. Although there were no trade routes nearby, obscure local folklore legends began making their way to the ears of researchers studying the site. It turns out there's a story of one King Raja Jazdaval of Kannauj. A tradition dating back to at least 800 AD is a pilgrimage in honor of the goddess Nanda Devi to her temple shrine, the Nanda Devi Rajjat. Beginning in the village of Naudi, 25 kilometers east of Karnprayag, the pilgrimage is meant to commemorate the journey that the goddess took to join her husband in the mountains. A long and arduous journey, the path of the pilgrimage passes right by Roopkund Lake, considered by those who make this pilgrimage to be a sacred place. The king took his pregnant wife with him, along with a troupe of dancers to entertain him. The legend goes that at Roopkund, the king was entertained by his dancers, which angered the goddess, sending a terrible storm, and they were killed by giant hailstones. Leaving aside the mythology and folklore, researchers do find that the circumstances might explain both the timing and the blunt force trauma injuries witnessed in some of the skulls that were found at the site. As researchers flooded to the site and stories spread about a mysterious lake full of bones, locals and tourists alike began flooding Roopkund, and the Indian government was doing close to nothing to protect the integrity of this anthropological site. Although the trek is one of the longest and most challenging hikes to go on, it's also known to be breathtakingly beautiful. And with its final destination being Roopkund Lake, the Roopkund Trek over the years became one of the most popular tourist attractions around, with hundreds of people making their way to this isolated lake, not only disturbing the remains and artifacts that were found there, but piling them up into makeshift shrines and even taking bones home with them as souvenirs. If researchers were going to get any answers about where these remains came from, time was critical before there was nothing left to study. And so an all-star team of anthropologists and researchers collaborated on the most intensive study of the site to date, releasing a paper authored by nearly 30 scientists from around the world who participated in this critical project. Researchers from both Harvard University and Harvard Medical School, the Anthropological Study of India, MIT, and many other well-known and respected institutions. With the biggest group of nerd Avengers possible to assemble,
safety glasses off, motherfuckers!
They set off for Roopkund. Until this point, it was generally assumed that all of the skeletons had been deposited at the site in one event, and there really wasn't anything that had been found so far that could have told them otherwise. At the time, a traveling group killed in a hailstorm seemed like a plausible explanation that fit the facts. But there was another wrinkle that would be revealed, deepening this mystery even further. They did 4 different tests on 76 individuals whose remains were retrieved from the site. They wanted to know 3 things. Where were they from? What was their diet? And they wanted to reconfirm, how old were these remains? The scientists selected these 76 individual skeletons to extract samples from, many of which would be used in multiple overlapping tests to correlate the data. The first clues that they were able to determine before any testing was that these individuals, by and large, were much taller than average given the locale and the time period. Other than the blunt force trauma in a few samples and some seemingly unrelated non-fatal injuries probably due to the harsh lives that they led, they all seemed more or less like healthy individuals, ranging from fully grown adults to children. Although radiocarbon dating had been done previously, this was a chance to revisit and reconfirm results found by other teams, and they weren't expecting too many surprises. They expected to find that these bones were from around the year 850, plus or minus 50 years, and it was generally assumed that whoever these people were, they all ended up there at pretty much the same time. So they took 37 individuals and submitted pulverized bone powder to determine the age of these remains. But this time they got a much different story. Take a look at these results directly from the report that they filed. They had previously understood that these bones were from around the year 850, yet we see a clear pattern that what we previously thought about this being one big event where all these people were deposited at the same time was very wrong. The oldest set of remains tested showed that they were deposited somewhere around 700, while the youngest from this group was from around the year 950. The margin of error doesn't even come close to overlapping. These remains were deposited in several events over the course of about 200 to 250 years. But the mystery didn't stop there, because it turns out that these bones sat undisturbed for close to 1,000 years, until an entirely separate group was deposited there. This was an extremely significant discovery, although it raised far more questions than it answered. What was this other group? So for our purposes from here on out, we're going to refer to the earlier group as Roopkund A, and the youngest of the group, the Roopkund B group. We now have an entirely separate population deposited in this same obscure, isolated lake in the middle of the wilderness, separated by 1,000 years. It was pretty much known that whoever these bones belonged to, they were from pretty close by. But could the genetic tests shed some more light? Of the 76 selected individuals, 38 were chosen for wide genome testing using nuclear DNA, the kind of genetic testing that you're probably more accustomed to hearing about. Many of these individuals were also part of the 71 that underwent mitochondrial DNA testing. So what's the difference? Inside the eukaryotic cells inside your body, you actually have 2 different types of DNA. You have your nuclear DNA and your mitochondrial DNA. The nuclear DNA, which is found inside the nucleus, obviously, contains all the instructions. It's the blueprint. It's everything that makes you, you. And it's encoded with 3 billion base pairs of nucleotides that are arranged in a long chain. And while nuclear DNA is found in only one location in your cells, which is the nucleus, the mitochondrial DNA is actually found much more abundantly throughout the cell, as you have lots more mitochondria than you have a single nucleus. And while there's 3 billion base pairs in your DNA strand, mitochondrial DNA is far less complex, containing only about 16,000. What makes mitochondrial DNA really interesting as well is that not only is it a little less complex, it's also its own unique genetic identity within your cells. Its genetics, its DNA, is a little different than the DNA that you find inside the nucleus. Now, while mitochondrial DNA doesn't contain quite as much information as nuclear DNA, it's very valuable to us in this particular situation. And the reason that is because when we're working with ancient samples like we are right now, we need to be able to draw a much broader sample. And when we're looking for a wide genome, like we are with the nuclear DNA, it's a lot harder to come by, whereas with mitochondrial DNA, you have a much larger sample pool, as there are a lot more samples within each cell, which works out great for us because we have a much smaller scope and scale in what we're looking for within the genetic information we're trying to extract. The mitochondria, which is known to be the powerhouse of the cell, is the driving force generating ATP, which gives our cells and our bodies the energy that we need from the calories that we take in. And although they are genetically different from the nuclear DNA that we all have, they are still linked to us enough that some important information can be gleaned, which can also serve to reconfirm what we find when we're doing wide genome testing using nuclear DNA. So, of the 38 that were selected for wide genome testing, they determined that 23 that make up the oldest group, Roopkund A, were from South Asia. No big surprise there on the surface, but what puzzled them was the fact that they weren't isolated to a particular location. They were from all over the region. None of them had any familial relationship to another person found, which means that they likely came from separate, unassociated communities. Genetically, the sample comprised of 23 genetic males and 15 genetic females. Because of their relatively high proportion of females, as well as there being children, this casts doubt on an earlier theory that these were soldiers. Most puzzling of all, and what was the most significant discovery made, was about this new Roopkund B group. They were deposited only a few hundred years ago, and they were from nowhere near where they were found. Mitochondrial DNA testing revealed that the Roopkund B group had markers in their genetics that were found exclusively in individuals that were from, of all places, the island of Crete in the Mediterranean. How on earth did a group of people from Crete find their way so far from home, and their remains found in such a remote and isolated place that it wasn't found for another 200 years, with no historical record of them ever being anywhere near the location that they were found? They also found another individual among the Roopkund B group that they created an entirely separate category for, Roopkund C. This single individual was found to be Han Chinese. Because this was a single sample, we don't know if other remains found at Roopkund share this regional origin, but it's just another layer that this mystery throws at us, without many leads for a good explanation. There really isn't much else we can say about the individual making up Roopkund C, so let's return to the individuals from the Mediterranean. There's no historical record of anyone from Crete living in the Himalayas. Because the remains had no genetic familial relations, we can deduce that this was a community that had moved to the area of the Himalayas and lived there for probably no more than a generation or two. It was noted by the researchers that if this was an isolated group of people living in a small community, you would see genetic markers consistent with either inbreeding or mixing with the population, and there was evidence of neither of that. Whoever these people from Crete were, and why they were so far from home, we know they had to have been living in the mountains for quite a long time. And the reason we know this was because of the bones themselves. You may not be aware of some of the impacts that your diet has on the chemical makeup of your body. In your bones, you have, among many other elements, the elements of carbon and nitrogen. Depending on your diet, you'll have a different makeup in your bones of the different isotopes of these two elements. Because the most abundant forms of carbon and nitrogen have the same number of protons and neutrons, they have an even atomic weight. But once in a while, an extra neutron finds its way into about 1% of these atoms, which gives the nucleus a kind of spin. When doing mass spectroscopy, you shoot radio waves at these atoms, and the less you see reflected back, you find a higher proportion of these spinning atoms, giving you an idea of the proportion of carbon-13 to 12 and nitrogen-15 to 14. Long story short, the proportion of carbon-12 and 13 atoms found in your bones tell us what kind of plants you ate within the last 5 to 10 years of your life, while the proportion of nitrogen-14 and 15 tell us what kind of meat you ate. This is kind of a massive overgeneralization, and I'm personally trying to wrap my own head around this topic, but I'll leave a link to a fascinating video by the University of Leiden that goes into this much more thoroughly and explains it far better than I can. You should definitely check it out. After sampling the bones and teeth of the remains that were found at Roopkund, it was found that Roopkund A's diet was pretty typical of what you would expect of people living in this region. Now, what's interesting about the results from Roopkund B is that we know a few things in particular. One, they were travelers. Keep in mind, we have evidence that they were genetically from the island of Crete, and they had no genetic markers from the surrounding area, which tells us that they had not mixed with the population. If they were a homogeneous group of people, isolated and living for a long time in the area, you would find either genetic evidence of inbreeding or that they had mixed with the rest of the regional population, neither of which they did according to their genes and their bones, and yet they had lived in the area for a long time. Keep in mind that isotope samples from bone give you a picture of the final 5 to 10 years of their life. If they had been recently living back home on the island of Crete, you'd find evidence of seafood in their diet according to the nitrogen readings. Yet their diet was consistent for up to 10 years with that of people living in the area. They hadn't lived near the sea eating fish for a long time. But other than the bones themselves, there's no historical record of them being here at all. Every time we study these bones, every team of researchers that venture into the high-altitude wilderness in pursuit of answers, we're just introduced to far more questions than the ones that we came with. And we're running out of time. Every time the public comes out here, they disturb the remains more and more, taking bones and artifacts home as souvenirs, piling them up in a way that makes it difficult to figure out where they originally were. The Indian government did shut down the Roopkund trek for now, but it seems to be a temporary closing, though the reasoning is not to protect this unique anthropological site, but because of trash left by tourists on the trail in a section of pristine woods on their way to Roopkund. So, although it may be protected for other reasons, we at least hopefully have some time before they're just gone forever.
That's why you get a lot of mistakes about history. Seeing the great temples, the great statues, and you think everything in history was perfect. And then when you see the people, you discover they're like us. Exactly like us. This is the real story.
So here we are. A decades-old mystery we're no closer to solve than we've ever been. Every clue leading us to more questions than answers. The unknown is something that simultaneously terrifies us and fascinates us. While it's always tempting to focus on the morbid and the macabre, we have to remind ourselves that although we can be separated by eons, each one of those people were just like you and I. Hundreds of human beings left and forgotten in one of the most isolated places on Earth. Every one of them a separate person who had their own story, their own hopes, dreams, loves, losses, a lifetime of experiences we may never know or truly understand, lost to time. There's perhaps no better example of this than the child Inca mummies found in 1999. Over 500 years old, they're considered the best preserved human remains in human history. Children that were sacrificed and left to expire high in the mountains. The faces, hair, hands, astonishing features that remind us how closely connected we all are. Thank you for watching. Out of the darkness, we can all find light. But for now, this is NightDocs, signing off.